Recently, I've been watching a number of documentary series on Netflix regarding true crime. I made a video about the Jeffrey Dahmer docu. Well, actually, it wasn't a documentary; it was a dramatization. I've just watched the Bundy tapes, and before that, I watched the John Wayne Gacy tapes. This video is not about serial killers, but it is about true crime. Um, the latest one I've watched was a very unusual case, and involves Sally McNeil and Ray McNeil, her husband. And what's so unusual about this case? It's on Netflix if you have it. It's called Killer McNeil. What's unusual about the case is that both the killer and her victim were bodybuilders, professional bodybuilders. Um, I'm going to just give some of the basics here. So if you want really extensive details about this case, then check out the Netflix series. If you don't have Netflix, there are some archives on YouTube, although they tend to be, from what I've seen, they're just snippets, so they're not really given too much context. They're snippets of her court appearances and so on. Just very broadly, this is very, very loosely laying out the case. Um, they came from similar backgrounds insofar as they had both been Marines. They were both into bodybuilding. Um, and there was an attraction there at the start. She was originally from Pennsylvania, but moved to California in, I believe it was 1987. Um, and after some time, the relationship became toxic, absolutely toxic. The documentary on Netflix is three parts. Um, First episode, I have very mixed views on the whole case. The first episode, I'm thinking this is a bit biased. It's like this is dubious because they're basically interviewing her. It's all from her point of view. However, they did interview the prosecution lawyer, uh, whose um, whose work in the case meant that she was actually jailed for 19 years for second degree murder. She was cleared of first degree murder, but she got 19 years for second degree murder. She was only released in 2020. The crime happened on Valentine's Day in 1995. So she spent actually longer than 19 years. She spent close to a quarter of a century behind bars for what she done. Now, this is a contentious case, as it almost always is when you have a man and a woman involved in an act of violence. Um, it's almost always more complicated than a woman and a woman, or much more commonly a man and a man, because there's always that gender dynamic. Now, like I say, the unusual thing about this case is both parties were professional bodybuilders, so she was by no means a conventional woman. I think that's fair to say, even though female bodybuilding was kicking off in the 1980s and 1990s. Um, and the whole case seemed to look at, was her a threat? Was she an abused woman or not? Because her defense team worked on this idea that she was a battered woman, and they actually advised her not to do her bodybuilding shots and so on during the trial. Um, and basically, there was infidelity in the marriage. It was also unusual in another aspect of the case. It was interracial. He was black, she's white. So there's just a lot of things about this case that are unusual. Um, I mean, like it stands out. But for me, what the talking point of this should be gender and violence, because I've just looked at a clip from one of the court hearings, and I don't know how many people watched that documentary series, but everyone was sort of jumping on a bandwagon and saying it was clearly self-defense. Now, their children, they had mixed race children, and those two children actually followed their parents' footsteps insofar as they both joined the Marines, and they both have had difficulties. They've both dealt with PTSD. The young guy said he's had a life where he's known nothing but violence, and it was an absolute hell in that house, as he put it. The daughter has dealt with domestic abuse herself. You know, I've never had to deal with that. I've never been in that situation, so I think it's difficult for those of us who haven't experienced it to really know what that is like, such a toxic environment. and it must have a profound impact on children. Now, Ray McNeil, all the indications are that he was indeed a violent and controlling man. Um, but here's the catch: she didn't fit into the sort of profile of a bad woman because she too had a violent history. Um, if not against him, certainly against others. This was a woman who did have apparently a temper problem. For example, her son got into a dispute with a classmate, and the father apparently reprimanded her son. But instead of just going and discussing it like an adult, she actually went to the man's house, rammed on his door, like knocked on it, and physically beat him up. Now, bear in mind, this woman was a professional bodybuilder, so she was probably physically stronger than the average man. That's why people looking at this from the normal prism of gender, um, it's misleading. Um, she also physically attacked a woman that her husband was having an affair with, or she suspected of having an affair with. She had a violent streak. Now, why did she get second degree murder and not manslaughter in the case of, I think California law would allow that in self defense? Well, the lawyer was kind of like the prosecution lawyer, kind of looked like a typical hardball lawyer, very, ruthless in his whole delivery. And the way he was being interviewed, he came across as, I mean, he was making valid points, but he basically fitted the stereotype of a ruthless lawyer. But regardless, one of the pieces of evidence was that on the night where they had this argument, or rather the night that the murder happened, the night where Ray McNeil died, um, she called the police and she admitted what she'd done. And there was some somewhat unsettling footage of the interviews in the police station and her talking to the children and they'd have to go away and so on. But the interesting thing was that the bloodstains were on the inside of a lampshade. This is significant because it was pointed out in court that had she been acting in self defense, like there was an imminent danger, then she wouldn't have shot him in the head. And the whole angle of this was a man who'd already been shot, he was on the ground, and the blood was basically squirting up. This wasn't someone who's kind of overbearing and she shot out of fear. That's very, very important actually, because it gets into whether this was premeditated or not. Um, My own feeling is it was a totally toxic relationship, and they were both violent individuals. Um, I mean, her son basically said it was hell in that house, and he did say that his stepfather was abusive. I think actually he was a son from a previous marriage, but he said that his mother was no typical housewife either, and basically alluded to her having a violent streak. It just sounds like an awful environment for children to grow up in. Interestingly, the documentary, there were three parts. It had very, very little in the way of talking about steroids because that's been an issue regarding bodybuilders, also professional wrestlers. It's a very infamous Chris Benoit, Nancy Benoit, and their child murder suicide. That within the wrestling community, that was like probably the most controversial thing ever. It was a huge thing at the time. Um, and apparently autopsies on Benoit's brain showed that he had a brain of a man in his 80s rather than 40, which is what he was. And there was a lot of debate and sometimes heated discussion within the wrestling community about the effect of steroids. Now, in the case of Benoit, he had a particular move that involved constant shots to the head. It was, I forget the name of the move, but that no doubt would have played a role in his, well, basically brain damage. But to what extent it had in on the night of the murder suicide. Um, so that's somewhat surprising that that aspect wasn't really discussed or brought up at all in the documentary. I'm not saying it's valid or not. I'm saying it wasn't brought up really at all, which is surprising. Um, both Sally McNeil and her husband had friends speaking about them, remembering them. Um, is she a victim or not? I think probably she was a victim of domestic violence. Um, I think there is evidence for that, but at the same time, I mean, the testimony of the children, I should say, they were stepchildren. But I think that, that they witnessed it. But I think that it's a dangerous narrative to suggest that some people get into this bandwagon that whenever you have a case that a man dies at the hands of a woman, it must be self-defense. It must always be self-defense. And there is another fact. He's dead. He can't defend himself. He can't defend his reputation. There was a case in the UK recently where an older woman killed her husband, and she cited that she was a victim of domestic violence. But this is almost always the case when a woman kills a man. That's what's cited, and it gets into this idea that women are not capable of being violent and they're not capable of being abusers. Look at the Depp Heard case. I think a lot of things came out from that that should change societal attitudes to violence. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not saying this guy was innocent. I do think that the testimony of the children certainly would indicate that Ray McNeil was a violent man or he had a violent and controlling streak. But was she abused to the point where she literally had to defend herself? Was this an imminent threat on the night of the murder? If you look at the documentary, I'm not sure that it was. Um, it may even be the case that she was angry at his infidelity. She was worried he was leaving her, and that's she lashed out. I mean, it's difficult to know. It's very difficult to know. The only people who really know the truth is her and the children. They were the only ones in the house that night. Now, the lawyer, like I say, who prosecuted her, he comes across as a typical cold, hard-boiled lawyer. But I understand why he took the strategy he did, and he did raise a fair point, which is that women can be violent. Women can be violent. And what I found striking about all the interviews that she done was that there was no sort of sense of remorse. It was always, I acted in self-defense, I acted in self-defense, but it just seemed that there was something missing there. I don't know. Having said that, she has served a very long time behind bars, in a notorious women's prison in California, and she's now released. She's happily married. I think that the message of this case is that the stereotype of gender roles should not always be taken at face value. I think the jury, remember, they're the ones who heard the evidence. I think they probably made the right decision. For all those people saying it was clearly self-defense, why are you second guessing the jury? They heard the evidence. Do you not think they would have seen it that way if the evidence suggests that that was purely the circumstances of the case? I won't put a link because I mean, if you don't have access to Netflix, you won't be able to see the link anyway. But Sally McNeil, Ray McNeil, 1995, California. It's a very intriguing case, and I think there's a lot of debate points around it. Um, but she has served her time, and she's now rebuilding her life. And I think that because of the backdrop, because it was such a toxic relationship, I think probably she shouldn't have got a life sentence. 19 years, well, longer than 19 years is probably even a bit harsh given the context of their relationship. But I don't know. However, what I would like to see is people not jumping on this bandwagon and just assuming every time that a woman is apprehended for killing a man, it must be self-defense. Oh, she must have been a victim of domestic violence. The point is, if the man is dead, he can't defend himself. He can't defend his reputation. In the case of the Amber Heard Johnny Depp thing, I think a lot came out of that case, which showed her toxic behaviour. And I don't think Depp was a saint, but I think that was a turning point. And what was notable about that case, at least I hope it's a turning point, but what was notable about that case is a minority of feminists, even then, were still saying, but she's a woman, she must be, the society is giving the man all the. No, it's because people were looking at the evidence of the case. And the fact of the matter is women have had the upper hand for a very long time, I would argue, in the Western world. when it comes to issues around violence. Now, I'm not saying that there is no problem with women not getting justice. There is. And there's also an issue where, it's like a Stockholm syndrome. If a man's abusing them, they're worried about leaving because, it's often this dynamic where they feel they won't find someone else or they won't be loved. It's a very, very difficult thing. So I would never, ever judge a victim. Um, I do think that this idea that women are not capable of violence is a sexist and archaic idea. It's not always the case. That's not to downplay the fact that there are definitely violent and controlling men out there, and I think they're the scum of the earth. But um, I just think that we need to stop being so black and white when it comes to gender issues. And by the way, the fact that she was physically smaller, a gun doesn't discriminate. A gun doesn't discriminate. So there could be too much weight on that. That might be a factor if they were physically in and like actually grappling with each other. But she's shot him from a range. It wasn't like they were physically grappling. Um, Incidentally, she also made money on the side by getting involved in sort of you know she didn't like the term fetish, but this thing where men would pay her to wrestle her. It was like some men like muscular women. That was a thing. But she made the point that her nickname in that Killer Sally, it was acting, and that doesn't mean that made her guilty. So, there's a lot of nuances to this case. What else can be said? Yeah, I mean, I really, really feel sorry for children in these cases because they're the ones who have to see violent adults or abusive and toxic relationships. That must have a profound effect on a child's development. It must be horrendous. I would conclude with this, like outside of this case, I would just conclude with one thought. I think that people shouldn't assume that just because women don't automatically leave that they're not telling the truth. Okay, so women who are abused definitely, I think there needs to be more justice. Sometimes the sentencing for violent men is far too lenient, certainly in this country, and then it ends up in tragedy. And the fact of the matter is, far, far more women are killed by men than men by women. So it's not equal. It's not an equilibrium in that sense. Women may be guilty of emotional abuse, but when it comes to the raw data, you could probably count the number of men killed by women in probably in the dozens. I don't know. That's a very, very, I don't know, but it will be a lot lower than women killed by men. I mean, it's rare you hear cases, for example, of a woman being involved in a murder suicide. Sometimes you hear of women killing their children, but it's rare that you hear of a woman killing her husband and children. And in Britain, we've had several such cases where a man has, I don't know, had a total meltdown or he's exploded and he's killed his family then himself. It's depressingly not uncommon. So I just think that with cases like this, people need to really, really look at the specific details and not just assume that it's black and white because it often isn't.